Today is September 18th, 2024. This is episode 46 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells. As usual, I'm joined by Joe Meade. Tonight, Joe and I will go over some of the big games from Week 3 and preview what is a pretty impressive slate in Week 4. So, Joe, unfortunately for the Big Ten, we are Big Ten-centric here on In a Nutshell. We're going to start off with the two games that went the worst for Big Ten teams, and the first, Notre Dame goes to Purdue out of a revenge spot, beats them 66-7. Notre Dame probably should have won this game. They are probably the better team, but this was definitely shocking to pretty much everyone.
Yeah, Sean, the spread on this was like anywhere from 7.5 to 10 throughout last week. And, one thing I'll give Notre Dame, and I don't think I gave them enough credit certainly going into, is whatever they've been in, especially in the Marcus Freeman era, aside from the time in his first actual regular season game against Ohio State, they've always bounced back. And we saw that last year at Duke when Sam Hartman led them on that game-winning drive where he had like that 14-yard run. They didn't need any heroics like that at all. I think this game was over by the second quarter, the start of the second quarter, because it was 42-0 at halftime. I don't really know what to think of Purdue as, because this was a golden opportunity to kind of make a name for yourself early. Still really early on in the Walters era, but certainly I don't even want to say a missed opportunity. Probably just let's forget about it. It's kind of what someone embarrasses themselves in public trying to ask out the maybe if they're a freshman, they're asking out the senior cheerleader, and it's something that could put you on the map, but usually it's not going to go your way. And unfortunately for Purdue, this is one to forget. We could talk at length about how Notre Dame dominated them on both sides of the ball, but I think the fact of the matter is Purdue's got a long way to go before they're back to even thinking about Indianapolis. I think right now they got to think about staying competitive in these games, and then next year we can talk about a more steady rebuild.
Yeah, it's just a real step back for the Boilers. We thought Hudson Card was an above-average quarterback. He had a terrible game, just 124 yards passing, 11 of 24, one touchdown, two interceptions. And Notre Dame rolled them. Purdue got work to do, as you said, Joe. Now, the other game that went poorly for a Big Ten team, again, as kind of expected, was Alabama going in to Camp Randall and blowing the brakes off of Wisconsin. The Crimson Tide win 42-10. Jalen Milroe has 5 touchdowns as he boosts his Heisman candidacy. But Wisconsin does lose their quarterback, Tyler Van Dyke, early on in this game. And after that, Joe, it didn't seem like they had much of a chance.
Well, it's interesting, shot as a lot of people compare this game to Michigan's blowout loss against Texas. I think each person knows which they would take. Not that 22 and 32 points where you get dominated start to finish is much of a difference. But Michigan came out of that game mainly pretty healthy, Sean. Wisconsin, unfortunately, the exact opposite. Tyler Van Dyke, who looked to have. He wasn't playing all that bad, 5 of 5, I get all for 16 yards, but, unfortunately it just goes down, and you knew right away, Sean, it was nothing good. And I think, unfortunately for Wisconsin, their third game into the year, this is already a huge inflection point. And the way we're going to view Wisconsin, especially in this Longo offense, is going to be drastically different than with Braden Locke. There's a reason they went to the portal. It's not to say they have no faith in these guys that were currently on the roster, but they clearly saw an upgrade with Tyler Van Dyke at quarterback. And now that he's out for the year, Wisconsin's probably got major recalibrations going on in the program. Luckily for them, this is their bye week before they go to USC.
Well-timed bye week.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, a well-timed bye week. And I can't think of a worse place to go after a bye week in a situation where you lose your starting quarterback than USC, because either way they're going to be riding high either after a huge victory against Michigan or they'll be very angry / disappointed after a loss to them. So that's going to be a really tough spot for Wisconsin. I think they're definitely going to have to dial some new plays in the playbook, maybe simplified for Braden Locke a bit, and not simplified in terms of that he doesn't know the plays. He's been there. More so, they have to cater to his abilities more. as opposed to what Tyler Van Dyke did. And we're going to get into this discussion a lot today, so I don't want to overstep and repeat the same point over and over, Sean. But aside from that, all you can take away from this game is that Wisconsin is much like Purdue, but probably further along than Purdue, still very far away from being a contender. And I get a lot of people are getting impatient year two with Luke Fickell, who is probably the most high-profile hire in the 2022 cycle. I think you still got to stay the course. I think they're implementing a new offensive system. I do think their D-line is going to have to get better in the years to come. But, Sean, after a game like this, it's really hard to stay positive, especially losing your newest leader, Tyler Van Dyke, if you're a Wisconsin Badger fan.
Yeah, ideally soon, Joe. We'd like to do a re-rack of the power rankings, and we'll see where these teams lie versus what we thought, a month or so ago when the season was about to start. And the two teams we've talked about today so far, definitely not much better than the start of the year, and probably worse. And another team, Joe, that is definitely stocked down since the beginning of the season, that's your Michigan Wolverines. Now, we're not going to talk about the game that much. They do beat Arkansas State 28-18. The game really wasn't that close. It was 28-3 with 6 minutes left. But the main comment coming out of here is Davis Warren is benched. Alex Orji will be the starting quarterback. He has completed 3 passes this year and 4 total in his career. But Warren was just simply not getting the job done, Joe. Michigan moves to Orji as a big game that we'll talk about later happens next week.
Yeah, I don't want to comment on this too much before we preview the USC-Michigan game. One thing I will say about Davis Warren, I think all of this is not his fault. I think most reasonable Michigan fans would concur, as well as many college football fans who've watched these games. Michigan's offensive line is mainly new starters together, and 3 of the 5 are first-time starters in all of college football. So I think them getting familiar with a new quarterback who, let's face it, Sean, Michigan's kind of handcuffed him. They don't really want him throwing the ball deep. They don't really trust him on these read options. They don't even give him the option to run on most plays. I think that was a recipe for disaster, and I think perhaps he was put in a position to fail by the coaches. Now, that's not to say that 2 of his 3 interceptions are excusable. They weren't. But I think when you have that much working against you, and then, you have the early test against Texas, that's not a great way to build your confidence. And I don't love the way that Michigan kind of put him into these games without, giving him a quick completion. You see guys like Lincoln Riley, Steve Sarkisian, Lane Kiffin. They start off the game getting their quarterbacks like a quick 5-yard completion most of the time, just get their confidence up. I don't think Davis could ever get into momentum. And unfortunately for him, it's led to his first demise. Now, that's not to say that the story's completely written on Davis Warren. I mean, we're barely 3 games into the year, and Michigan's quarterback position, if the last 3 games have served as any lesson, this might not be the last change they make.
Yeah, it's certainly been a hindrance so far, and you're going to need better quarterback play than anything that's happened so far to win on Saturday, most likely. Joe, we've got 2 more games here that we want to talk about from Week 3. The first one is the Apple Cup between Washington State and Washington. We haven't talked much about the Huskies this year, and we said that may have been a good thing, may have been a bad thing, but they do lose this one to Wazoo, 24-19. You've got Will Rogers performing okay, 314 a touchdown. Giles Jackson, 8 for 162, the former Michigan man, getting in the end zone as well. But at the end of the day, Washington, the runners-up from a year ago, now granted a completely different team, they take their first loss of the year. Disappointing to say the least.
Sean, it's I think it's a matter of Washington just missed too many opportunities. They couldn't convert on 4th down. They had to settle for field goals, and ultimately the Cougars took advantage. And all I'm going to say, Sean, is I don't really know if this narrative that like the underdog rah-rah story is that big of a factor. I know it's always been a factor in this rivalry, but to say the least, Sean, this was one of the stranger games. This wasn't even at Washington or Washington State, at a neutral site. And one thing I'll say, Sean, is Washington State celebrated winning this game kind of like they won a conference title. So kind of speaks volumes to what it means for them. I don't know with all the new guys on Washington, uh, if they really knew uh, how much they really like bought into this rivalry, especially going this early into the season. This game's always been on the Friday after Thanksgiving, Sean. So perhaps that's a factor. One thing I'll say about the play of Washington is they have to finish, and I think they will. I'm a big believer in Jed Fish. His teams have progressively, from his time play calling at Michigan to UCLA to Arizona, they've consistently gotten better throughout the year. I think this is certainly a sour point. It really sucks to lose to your in-state rival and to have them celebrate at CenturyLink the way they did, or whatever the heck CenturyLink is called now. But
What is it called now?
I have no idea, to be honest, Sean. I just think of it as
Lumen
Seahawks
Field.
Stadium.
How about that?
Lumen Field, yeah. Well, goes to show our childhood's gone. But regardless, Sean, I think Will Rogers is still doing a good job protecting the ball. I think they certainly need to take advantage of more. They need to take advantage of more of their red zone opportunities. And I think with Jed Fish's play calling, I think he's still getting a familiarity with his roster. Only 3 games in. Though plenty of opportunities coming up, I'll tell you that. They have Northwestern this week, starting off conference play at Rutgers, and then national title game rematch against Michigan. So I think you win 2 of those 3 games, the fan base is pretty happy, and perhaps the sour taste of the apple, for a terrible reference and a terrible analogy, I almost want to smack myself for saying it, will not last too long.
And Joe, you mentioned Washington State celebrating like it's their conference title. Well, they don't have a conference title to play for this year, so this might be that. And in other news, the Pac-12 does have some new teams. We're not a Pac-12 podcast, but the Pac-12 lives. They'll get 4 members from the Mountain West, San Diego State, Fresno State, among other teams. But good news for them. And then, of course, they win the rivalry game, too, which is even better. But tough news for Washington there. The last game, we had a number of other Big Ten wins: Northwestern, Nebraska, Maryland, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan State. Really, the main storyline from all those is the big boys took care of business. But we had a Big Ten game, Joe, at the Rose Bowl. Indiana goes in there and crushes UCLA 42-13. Kurtis Rourke passes for 4 touchdowns as the Hoosiers go in and out without even breaking a sweat. Indiana turning some heads early on.
Sean, I don't remember the last time Indiana went into, and albeit we know UCLA is definitely now going to finish at the bottom of the conference. I mean, this is more of a question for you, Sean. What's the last time Indiana went into a Big Ten opponent where they've been like they were a 3-point favorite? That's not a tangible spread to think that you'd blow a team out by. What's the last time you even remember seeing something like that?
I don't. And
yeah.
And we did say Indiana should probably win this game, but Indiana marches down the field, touchdown. UCLA fumbles the first snap off of a bye week, and then Indiana scores again. That was game over. It was 14-0, and that really was game over. Now, UCLA did bring it back to 21-10, but Joe, I watched most of this game, and it never... It looked like an NFL team versus a college team. And UCLA was supposed to have a good defense. And Cignetti has always been a pretty good offensive coach, and it seems like he's got one of the best quarterbacks in the conference, maybe even the country. Their offense is rolling. Now the question is where their defense will stack up against good offenses, but we thought UCLA would finish at the bottom. Now that's kind of definitely going to happen, but Indiana, the ceiling might be a little higher than we initially thought.
1,000%, Sean. I think you hit it on the head with Rourke. I think their number of different targets is really exciting for them. Miles Cross, Omar Cooper, Elijah Surratt. Cignetti's got something. He's got a lot of tools to work with. Now, I think, there's a guy in my office, big Hoosier fan and alum. I think you got to pump the brakes on the 12-team talk for now. I think that's
for sure.
Perhaps a few steps ahead of where they're at. But this team's not going to be taken lightly anymore, I'll tell you that. They have Charlotte. I think Maryland, Northwestern, Nebraska at home, Washington at Michigan State. Now, if you look at those games together, perhaps going undefeated in those is a big jump. But if you look at those on an individual basis, there's a path to victory for Indiana in all of those. I don't want to go too far into November, but I think Indiana at 3-0. I don't think people expected them to, drop one of these first three, perhaps even though UCLA is, they had the home field advantage. I do think the way they've done so, without even being challenged, has definitely turned heads. And to be a 28.5-point favorite against Charlotte, last year, Sean, Indiana, for reference, would probably be like a 7.5, 10-point favorite against the same Charlotte team. So definitely taking a huge step as a program. I think for now they just got to ride this momentum. Eventually they're going to hit adversity, but till then, I think they should just enjoy the ride.
In terms of a wide receiver room, Joe, like you said, you have those three. And you also have what many people think is the best in McCulley, who hasn't played much. He's more of a decoy in this game, but clearly isn't up to speed yet, so he can't be in there all the time. But there's a couple NFL players in that wide receiver room, and that's something that has never been said of an Indiana team in my recent memory. Now, Joe, you don't like to schedule watch like you said, but Saturday, October 19th, Dylan Raiola and Nebraska coming to town. Is that a potential game day appearance? The rest of the schedule isn't great that weekend, which is why I make the claim, but we're not there yet, but we might be very soon.
All I'm saying is the fact that's even a consideration 3 weeks into as we're going into the fourth week of the regular season. I think you would tell most Hoosier fans that after Curt Cignetti's electric speech that Friday night basketball game, and they would take it. So I speak for a lot of Big Ten fans. I don't think a lot of folks in the Midwest particularly care for Indiana basketball. I'll tell you, I think a lot of them are rallying behind Curt Cignetti and Indiana. Perhaps not their first team, but definitely a feel-good story. And after a guy gives a speech like that, it's really hard to not cheer for him, to be quite honest with you, Sean.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of Big Ten fans call Indiana America's team, and now they played well once. But if they roll off, they've got some favorable games early on here in the Big Ten. If they get 2-3-0 in the Big Ten, the neutrals they're fun to watch. As an Indiana fan, they're fun to watch, but as a neutral, they are too. Now, Joe, let's turn the page to Week 4. We've got a number of games we want to touch on here, and potentially the biggest one of the weekend is Friday night in Lincoln. The newly ranked Illinois Fighting Illini at 24 had to play Dylan Raiola and the Cornhuskers at 8 o'clock on Fox. Both of these teams have numbers next to their name, which we certainly did not see coming early on in the year. Nebraska 7.5-point favorite, so the Huskers should be winning this game, but what are you looking out for here?
Sean, the biggest thing is just all eyes, unfortunately. Unfortunately, if you're a freshman hater, but fortunately, if you're a Dylan Raiola fan and so responds to the hype since his recruitment, all eyes are going to be on him. Because this is the exact kind of game Brett Bielema has made his... Let's face it, Sean, he's made his reputation off this. At Wisconsin, prior to them becoming the powerhouse they were in the late 2000s, in the early 2010s, before he dashed for Arkansas, these were the kinds of games they would win. They would play a team with a younger, inexperienced quarterback, and he'd force them into mistakes. Now, Dylan Raiola's looked really good. He's only thrown 1 interception through 3 games. He's taken 1 sack, which I think speaks to the offensive line. And on another note, Sean, Matt Rule's done a phenomenal job of making his decisions easier. And that's not to say that he's babying him. I think he's more guiding him into the offense. Now, you could get into an argument whether guiding and babying is the same thing. But I think Matt Rule's played it pretty smart. Clearly he has. They're 3-0. They're back in the top 25. I think Nebraska hasn't been there in quite some time, which is pretty shocking, and I don't think they're going to hang their hat on that, certainly. One thing that doesn't get enough credit is their running backs can extend drives between Dante Dowdell, Emmett Johnson, Ramir Johnson, who seems to have been there forever, Ramir Johnson, who's also getting involved in the passing game as well, and they're masterfully using him as a decoy at times too. This is a team that could stay on the field, and for a team like Illinois, whose offense, let's face it, Sean, I know they beat Kansas, but a lot of that was due to their defense. That might put this defense in a compromising position, especially if Dylan Raiola is smart with the ball like he's been the last 3 games. What's going to come down to, Sean, is if Brett Bielema could fool Dylan Raiola, and more importantly, Sean, if Nebraska's offense can keep the drives going. I think Illinois' offense is what it is. I think Luke Altmaier's smart enough. He's a seasoned veteran. He can extend some plays. But Nebraska's D-line's going to get to him. Illinois is not going to be able to run too much on them. I think it's going to come down to Nebraska playing mistake-free football, something they did against Colorado. Now this is the main event, Sean. Colorado was a huge win. I get the history behind it. The two former, well, at least Nebraska being a former Big 12 school. This is a conference game. This is why Matt Rule was brought to Nebraska. This is a game they're favored to win by 7.5. It's a game they probably should win. And it's about time Nebraska became relevant in the Big Ten conversation. What better way to start it off with a Friday night on Fox?
Yeah, before the year, Joe, we said we expect Nebraska to probably be ranked at some point in the year, and maybe they would hop in and hop out. Well, this is a great opportunity to not hop out at your first opportunity. You get a ranked team, you should win it at home. You have a better quarterback than Illinois. All signs are pointing to a Nebraska victory here unless they stub their toe. Now, Luke Altmaier can't play good enough to give Illinois a chance. That's certainly on the table. But as the home team, you have the better quarterback. You have the better all-around team. The only situation where they might be outmatched is coach, and Matt Rule's a good coach. So I'm picking Nebraska to win here, but Illinois certainly has impressed so far since I picked them second to last in the conference, and we'll see where they end up on our conference re-rack here whenever that happens. Now, Joe, we've got a couple of non-conference games between Maryland, Indiana, and Ohio State. Not much to talk about there. Let's hope there's not much to talk about next week there, or that would be in trouble. There is another one here, though, Joe. Penn State versus Kent State. The Nittany Lions are favored by 49 points, but they're missing a pretty important piece in this one.
Unfortunately, this is something that's been in the news and kind of in rumor mills, but especially with injuries with college players, I don't like speculating. But now, with James Franklin's word, Penn State's leading tackler from last year, Kevin Winston Jr., who's probably going to be a pretty high draft pick, even still with this long-term injury. James Franklin said it all. I don't think he said he's done for the year, but a long-term injury. The media didn't even try to get an elaboration on that because it does not spell great news for Penn State. I know Tom Allen's a first-year D coordinator. I know James Franklin's calling card's been the defense the last few years. No matter how you want to spin this is a huge loss for the Nittany Lions. I don't think it's going to affect them against an opponent where they're still favored by almost 50. But as you get to this part of this schedule, they have Illinois next week. No matter what happens Friday, that's not going to be as easy a game as they thought. This is going to be something that they're just going to test their depth. They've recruited very well. If you look at the 2021 to 2023 recruiting classes for Penn State, they've all been inside the top 10. They've averaged, I think, like the 8th or 9th class between those three. This is where their depth's going to be pretty big, and I don't really know what to make of it. I don't know how they're going to fill this out, whether it's one guy or just by committee. But Kent State's going to be the game to figure out because Illinois, as shown from 3 years ago, Sean, Brett Bielema doesn't really fear Penn State too much. Even last year's game, I understand the score ended in a blowout. There were times in that game where Luke Altmaier made really bad decisions and threw picks. Penn State's kind of not in the best position with this. Now, injuries are going to happen, but you don't count on long-term injuries to your leading tackler, especially one that's going to go pretty high in the draft next year.
See how they react to that. Up next, Joe, we've probably got another potential game of the week. The USC Trojans head up to the defending champion Michigan Wolverines, 3:30 p.m. on CBS. What looked like it might be a good, solid Michigan favorite here at the beginning of the year has now turned the other way with USC's impressive play and Michigan's subpar play. The Trojans go into the Big House, 5.5-point favorites, and what we've seen so far, Joe, you have to say that that's pretty fair.
Yeah, Sean, this game almost had a 15 to 17-point swing depending on what sports book you've looked at. Michigan going into the year was anywhere from like a 9.5 to an 11.5-point favorite in this game. Even after the Texas game, the line kind of stayed at 9.5, but I think as the week went on and as the Arkansas State game progressed, a lot of people in Las Vegas, quite frankly, has lost faith in Michigan. Now, by no means am I going to defend Michigan or criticize USC too heavily. One factor that's giving a lot of pundits pause, particularly a Josh Pate, a college football with Sam, is USC's test was against LSU, while Michigan's was against Texas. I don't think there's much debate whether Texas is a top 3 team in this country.
Probably number 1 at this point.
Yeah, and the AP poll does agree. Not that that's everything, especially on September 18th shooting this. So you take that with a grain of salt. All I'm going to tell you, Sean, is the way LSU got bullied by South Carolina, although still winning, kind of gave some pundits some pause, being like, listen, USC's defense is definitely improved. D'Anton Lynn deserves a ton of credit. But can they physically match up with Michigan? Now, Michigan's O-line's been very suspect, but the way LSU got bullied around on both sides of the ball by South Carolina and by USC was somewhat similar. Now, Michigan's D-line against Texas did not do well, but I think a main part of that was coaching. They physically won a lot of battles. They put Quinn Ewers out of the pocket a lot of times in the first half before the game was effectively over at halftime. I think USC is going to be in a few compromising positions. I don't think they're going to game plan away from that. I think Lincoln Riley knows. He's watched a lot of film. He knows what Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, and Rayshon Benny bring, as well as Wick Martindale on certain blitz packages. This game's going to come down to, Sean, I really believe this. Michigan, immediately, if they score first, their chances of winning are in the upper 90%. It's pretty ridiculous since 2020, and you can throw the Connor Stallions jokes aside. Their record in games where they've scored first, in games they've scored first for reference, Sean, they've only lost 1, and that was Michigan State of 2021. That's a pretty scary thing to go against, especially now that Alex Orji's playing, Sean. They're not going to be passing the ball much. They're going to be predominantly running. And if Michigan could chug away first downs, go on 10 to 15 play drives with the lead, USC might feel, this is called the Army analogy, Sean, where you're playing a service academy. It feels like you're down 7. I mean, you're actually down 7, but it feels like you're down 14 with the way they kill clock. And I think USC, no matter what happens, whether they win the toss or Michigan wins the toss, I think one way or another they'll get the ball first. And I think, like Texas, they're going to have to drive down the field, and unlike missing a field goal, USC's going to have to get on the board first to make Michigan comply to their game. Because if USC tries to play the Michigan game or is forced to play it, that might take this game away out of their hands. Before I give my pick, Sean, what are your overwhelming thoughts?
I think it's a big game for the coaching staff for Michigan. Let's face it, you didn't have your players ready for Texas. You could have lost that game. You could have put up a good effort, and it could have just not gone your way. And you could have said, all right, well, you played all right. Texas is just better. That would have been fine. That didn't happen. The game was over early. That cannot happen here, and it very well, like, there's a situation where it could happen. USC could come down, Miller Moss could be slinging it all over the place, and then Michigan falls down 10-0, and then that's it with the way that their offense is. So, big on the coaches. I thought Wink got absolutely schooled by by Sarkisian in the Texas game. Now, Lincoln Riley's a good offensive coach too. He'll be trying to do the same thing. You're an NFL coordinator. Got to get your players ready to give you a chance. I think all the defense has to do is give them a chance. They're at home, and that's how you win these games, where you're not favorites. You stick around. You don't make silly mistakes like penalties, 15-yard penalties, or turnovers, and you just happen to be winning when the clock strikes 0. That's really it. Like you said, Joe Orji, is he just not throwing it at all, or very limited until he gets to 3rd and long or something like that? Like, he's no threat at all with his arm?
Based on a lot of camp reports, and you always take those, whether good or bad, with a grain of salt.
Well, he didn't start the season as a quarterback, so that should tell you enough.
Yeah, I think the throwing disparity between him and Davis Ward in practice was large enough. Let's face it, Sean. When it comes to putting the better athlete in at quarterback, if it's a little close in favor of like a Davis Warren type, they'll give it to Alex Orji. So I think that gives a lot of people pause. Another thing, Sean, is if you want to run the option, the triple option, or have a run-heavy offense on any individual play, sure, I understand how you have to commit another defender. That'll open up some running lanes, perhaps for Donovan Edwards or Kalel Mullings. You have to commit to that offense early on. Alabama in 2023 did that early on. They knew in January what Jalen Milroe was. They knew he was a decent enough thrower, but in reality, he was going to kill people with his legs, and that's exactly what they did. From February to December, Bill O'Brien figured, hey, I mean, my bad. Tommy Rees figured, hey, listen, all we need to do is just put our players in a position to win. He did that. Now, Michigan, unfortunately, with Alex Orji, didn't commit to that. They committed to it in on what September? What was Saturday? September 15th, the evening of Sunday, September 15th. You needed to commit to that probably the evening of January 9th, the day after you won the national title. And unfortunately for Michigan, they wanted to be more balanced. I don't blame them for that. But now that that plan's gone up in smoke, I don't think they're going to not face the music per se. Even if they win this game, drastically changing an offense like that, it's going to have consequences one way or another. I really think it'll happen on Saturday, whether that's them stalling out, whether it's guys missing blocks getting confused, and Alex Orger, running back, getting lit up for someone missing an assignment. But even if it's not this week, it'll be against Minnesota, it'll be against Washington. And if you're Michigan, looking at this schedule between USC, Minnesota, Washington, then your bye week, USC's your ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card, Sean. The narrative on this team is that it's been one of the most disappointing teams, aside from maybe Notre Dame, who's not feeling the heat after that 59-point win in West Lafayette. This is your get-out-of-jail-free card, Sean. You beat USC, you got a top 10 win under your belt, you've only lost to the number one team in the country. Assuming you went out to the bye week, you're 5-1 with a top 10 win. No one's going to complain, and that's kind of what Chalk's been. So, Michigan, this is going to go one way or another. This is going to be my pick. USC, I think, is going to win like 30-17. If Michigan wins, it won't be close. It'll be one of those typical Michigan, like 28-17, or a two-score win where they're up 7 late and then they go on a finishing drive. I have a hard time believing this 5.5 is going to hold one way or another. I think whoever wins is going to be by 2 touchdowns. And one way or another, Sean, Michigan's either going to have extreme praise on this podcast next week, or we're going to be ripping them to shreds. And I'm kind of leaning towards the latter. I think they're going to be ripped to shreds.
I don't think it's an overreaction to say that college football playoff hopes are on the line here. If you lose this, it might be over. You have a loss, you have a Big Ten loss, and if you lose, you're probably not going to beat Oregon and Ohio State. But if you win this game, Joe, then you're like, all right, well, we can win one of those other two, and then we'll head into the college football playoff with 2 losses, 1 Big Ten loss. You might get in the Big Ten championship game that way, but all things set aside, you've got to win this week if you're Michigan. And we've talked a lot about Michigan. Most of the questions are with them, Joe, but USC has only played 2 games, and their big win against LSU was not against an elite defense. So are there any questions on how USC's sort of new-look offense without Caleb Williams actually is going to stack up against a good defense, if you want to call Michigan that?
Well, I think that's certainly going to be put to the test, Sean. I think the way Texas kind of picked apart Michigan early in the passing game, allowed running lanes to open, USC certainly has capabilities to do that. So, Sean, I think USC would be foolish to not implement the same game plan Steve Sarkisian did against Michigan, to attack them in the air early, see what they could get. I do think Woody Marks is a guy from Mississippi State who he's been in enough college football games. He's going to be patient. I don't think he's going to get discouraged early in the first 2 drives if he gets, 4 carries for 3 yards or 5 yards. They might commit to that running game should the passing game start to go. And if both things are working, it's going to be a long afternoon for the Wolverine defense. I do think it's still one of the premier units in college football. I think their D-line is going to get a lot of push on this offensive line. It's just a matter of Lincoln Riley can account for that and scheme around it the same way Steve Sarkisian did. If USC gets the ball out quick and Michigan misses tackles, I think USC is going to be cackling with joy on the sidelines, just knowing that Michigan's offense probably is not going to do too much to them, barring a turnover.
I'm going to go prediction time, Joe. I'm going to go with a Michigan by a field goal. I think they're going to rise to the challenge and get the job done. You have faith in your guys?
I have faith that it's going to go one way or another, and that's a really cop-out answer. I just don't see this game being close. I think a lot of people do. I see one team. I just think it's two different styles, Sean. Whatever team implements their style of game on the other is going to win. And I think it's going to happen pretty early on. I think by halftime, I'll have a pretty good read on this. And no matter what happens, whoever has a two-score lead in this game, I find it virtually impossible how that team's not going to win the game.
Yeah, it's a narrow margin for Michigan, but there's certainly a way that they could instill their will in this game and win 23-13, and it's not really close. And USC looks awful on offense, and Michigan finds a way to score 2 touchdowns and a couple field goals. But that's certainly an interesting one. Could be 42-7 USC too. But next game up, Joe, we got UCLA going to Baton Rouge to play LSU. The Tigers are 24-point favorites. UCLA gonna struggle in this one, likely.
Yeah, Sean, I think the level upset this would be. I couldn't even tell you. I don't want to say Stanford over USC from 2007 because that was as egregious a victory as you could find, being that USC was ranked #1. LSU is certainly not that. The only way UCLA keeps this somewhat competitive is if Ethan Garbers isn't just running for his life every play and turning the ball over. Short of that, I think this is going to be a really long afternoon for UCLA. Yeah, Sean, I really don't think tickets are as low as $14. This tells you no one in Baton Rouge really wants to see this game either. So, yeah, Sean, I want to give UCLA some hope. I'd just be lying if I thought they had any chance. I think their defense is going to get picked apart. I think this is going to be an experimentation, confidence-building game for LSU. And if I'm saying that about you as the opponent, that's kind of an insult. So I don't want to insult UCLA further.
We've got another Big Ten team on the road in non-conference. That's Rutgers going down to Blacksburg to play the Hokies of Virginia Tech. The Hokies are 3.5-point favorites. Interesting here that Rutgers goes in as the dog. I'm a little bit surprised to see that. But if you're Rutgers, if you want to get to where your fans think that you are, got to win this ball game.
This is going to fall on the shoulders of athlete Kalakmanis. If Virginia Tech doesn't stuff the box to limit Kyle Monungai, and I say limit because he's going to have some big plays in this game, Kalakmanis is going to be on him to deliver the ball. This was a theme we saw in the first 2 games for Rutgers. We saw a clear difference between him and Gavin Wimsatt from last year. He's putting the receivers in positions to succeed. Now, those were against 2 more than inferior opponents. I don't think Virginia Tech, especially after that loss to Vanderbilt, is the juggernaut a lot of people thought they were. Few guys, I'm not going to call them out, on the game day panel did have them winning the ACC, some as high as the 3 seed. I think that ship has long sailed. If you lose to Vanderbilt, I think you should have that automatically revoked, even if you do win out. So I actually like Rutgers a lot in this game. I think they established the run. I think defensively they are what they are. They're not going to let up big plays. They're going to make crisp tackles. They're going to they'll stay in their gaps assignment-wise. Sean, give me Rutgers this one. I think they win by a substantial margin. I think they win by 10+. And I do think Athan Kalakmanis kind of shows that he can be more than a game manager. He can make some good throws, and so long as he doesn't try to be Superman, which he doesn't need to be, I think Rutgers rides into Big Ten play 3-0 with a huge non-conference win.
And I was looking at October 19th. I don't think Indiana will be game day that week. Georgia goes to Texas that week. So
yeah,
forget that I said that. I thought Georgia-Texas was the 12th, but it's not. Yeah. So that Indiana will not be having game day with Nebraska. Probably not. We've got a couple Big Ten games here, Joe. Northwestern visits Washington as the Huskies start off their campaign. Northwestern still trying to shake off that loss to Duke. Washington, revenge spot here. You'd have to think the Huskies would prevail here as they are double-digit favorites.
Yeah, I don't know. This is kind of like two, and I get it. Jed Fish is an offensive guy. How can I call him conservative? Jed Fish doesn't do anything egregious. He's not a Les Miles. He won't go for it on 4th and 5 or perhaps even a Sarkisian. He won't go for it on 4th and 5 from his own 40. Short of Will Rogers throwing picks in this game, though, Sean, I see this being I think the spread does it justice. I see this being a very 31-21-esque game. I think Washington gets an early lead. Northwestern kind of sticks around, but I don't think they have the horses to keep up. Uh, I do think Cam Porter might have some big plays. I just don't think. I really don't think Mike Wright has the ability to make enough plays in this game to keep it competitive or to really put a scare into Washington. Now, Will Rogers has done a great job protecting the ball. Uh, I don't see that changing against Northwestern. I think it's going to be drilled into his head that if they end every possession with a kick, it's going to be virtually impossible for them to lose. So give me the Huskies here. They get their first Big Ten win. And then they have a huge game next week at Rutgers on a Friday night. I do think that's one of the more underrated games of the conference this year, just based on what we've seen from those two teams. So uh, this is a great uniform battle, too. Purple versus purple. You don't often see that. So I think if you're an aesthetic college football fan, I get how we had Michigan, Texas, and whatnot. But I think this is a pretty cool matchup on see how the field play out, not just on a video game.
Yeah, Joe, this is one where I'm still not really sure about either of these teams. A lot of the teams are like, oh, this team is better than we thought. This team is not as good as we thought. These teams are kind of not, haven't really made an opinion on me. I know Washington lost a tough game. Northwestern lost a tough game. Those could have gone either way. So you don't think either of these teams are particularly that good, but they also shouldn't be near the bottom of the conference. So this is one of those middle of the pack battles that is probably going to, could cost the team 4 or 5 spots in the standings at the end of the day for the winner. But I do think Washington should win this one. The final score might not tell the story, but if they're not winning, going to win this game in the second or third quarter, I think that should spell danger for the runners-up from a year ago. Next game, Joe, 7:30 on NBC. Iowa visits Minnesota. The PJ Fleck game, I guess, as you want to say. This was the game last year where Cooper DeJean returned the punt that didn't count, and then Minnesota ended up winning. Iowa slight favorites on the road here. They still are trying to shake off their loss in the Cyhawk. They did beat Troy last week. Minnesota also still trying to form the shape of their season after losing in week 1. So which way do you see this going?
Yeah, the Florida-Rosedale game, Sean. This is pretty interesting. I understand Minnesota won last year. The last time they won in Minneapolis, Sean, was 2014. That was 10 years ago. That's kind of astonishing. I was reading into that prior to the podcast. I knew it had been a while. Iowa's dominated the rivalry. You just figure you get more than 1 in 10 years when you're Minnesota. For reference, in 2010 and 11, when Minnesota was at the very bottom of the conference, they still won 2 of those games back-to-back years. Those were both in Minneapolis, by the way. So pretty interesting tidbit. Sean, this game is the over-under in this game. I think it's 36.5 right now, 35.5.
Oh boy.
Yeah, it was 12-10 last year. I think they achieve higher than that, but not by much. I don't think either Cade McNamara or Max Brosmer is going to do anything drastic to have any big plays, and I say big plays as in anything over 25 yards. Normally I say 40 yards. In this game, anything over 25 yards is going to be a monumental play. Between Darius Taylor and Caleb Johnson, I'd be shocked if either defensive coordinator does not load the box. I don't think Cade McNamara in a while has shown ability to beat anyone deep, let alone Max Brosmer. I think he could be a danger with his legs, which is even more reason to keep guys close and not send 2 safeties back. So the key factor in this game, Sean, is whether Cade McNamara is smart with the ball and whether Max Brosmer is smart with the ball. That's a really lame cop-out answer. I totally get it. But in a game where you're expected to each score probably 15 or 16 points a pop, possessions are really going to matter. And the field position battle is going to be huge. I know PJ Fleck at Iowa, this is kind of their calling cards. Iowa's most popular player over the last probably 5 years, besides Jack Campbell or Cooper DeJean, was Torrey Taylor, their punter. That speaks volumes to kind of football they play. Phil Parker is kind of an icon of the conference at this stage, the way Iowa's played defense. So, Sean, I'd be shocked this game total gets over 40 points. And I really think this is a coin flip game. 2.5 indicates that. I'm going to say give me the Gophers in a night game. I think they do it. I think they get 2 in a row against the Hawkeyes. Based solely on the fact, I think Max Brosmer has a little more playmaking ability than Cade McNamara. I do favor Caleb Johnson a little over Darius Taylor. I just think the duo of Brosmer and Taylor, and then I also think Daniel Jackson's going to have to make a few plays here and there. I think the playmaking ability of Minnesota slightly edges that of Iowa, and give me them at home. So I'll give Minnesota, let's call it 19-17 in a very I'm gonna say the under. 19-16, just a half point under.
And it is truly, Joe, going to come down to who turns it over more. And another thing that might not be so great for Minnesota fans to hear, but I think it might come down to the kickers. And that already cost Minnesota. The North Carolina game for Minnesota is kind of exactly how you see this one going. Right, that was 19-17 with a bunch of field goals. Both teams, or North Carolina scoring 1 touchdown, Minnesota scoring 2. Like, I don't think either team in this game will score 3. So I think it will come down to the kickers and then like punt returns and interceptions and fumbles. Like, that's really it. I can't really see this game being a blowout. Maybe like a 17-3, but I don't really know if that counts as a blowout. But certainly will not be the one for the this is like the old Big Ten West. Definitely going to be some hard-nosed football, a lot of runs, a lot of punts. But I think it'll come down to the kickers, and Minnesota's has already cost them 1 this season. I think that might happen again. So give me the Hawkeyes on the road. A game, Joe, that once was not going to be that big of a game, but it turns out to be kind of a sneaky big game here on the ACC network at 8 o'clock on Saturday. That's Michigan State going to Chestnut Hill to play Boston College. The Spartans shook off a tough Week 1 victory against Florida Atlantic with the victory at Maryland in the Big Ten. They beat Prairie View A&M 40-0. Eden Childs is starting to look a little better up there, and Jonathan Smith certainly proving that he can coach. But Boston College has been one of the surprises of college football this year. They did get a road win at Florida State, and they did perform pretty admirably in a loss on the road at SEC School Missouri. So Boston College has 6.5-point favorites here as the home team and probably the better team, but Michigan State certainly capable of surprising with an upset, as we've already seen this year.
It's pretty funny, Sean. It's kind of a similar theme. Now, the over in this game is certainly a lot higher than 35.5, looking at nothing aside from
46.
Aside from you on the screen. Yeah, exactly, as it should be. Aiden Childs, I understand a lot of Michigan State fans' frustration. I do think they're able to acknowledge that he's young. He turns the ball over a lot, but I think he literally is told to be Superman, especially as they're down to their third-string right guard, I believe, Sean. Injuries have just destroyed this team 3 weeks into the year. At some point, that's going to come to bite them, and I don't want to say that as like the bearer of bad news. The fact they're 3-0, undefeated in the conference, 1-0. I know it's 1-0 against Maryland. I think even being competitive in this game, Sean, Boston College is an effective top 25 team. Being competitive in this game signals to me that games that they thought were going to be blowouts, now it's not going to be Oregon, Ohio State, but games like Iowa, Michigan, even maybe a Rutgers, and you throw that in there. Those are all games that it's in the realm of possibility Michigan State could win, or at least keep it very respectable. So, in a way, Sean, if Michigan State wins this, I don't really think you can keep them out of the top 25. I think, especially if they cover, I know they won't be ranked at 3-1. I would personally put them in my top 25 if they covered this. I'd be seriously impressed. So, all that said, Sean, it's going to come down to Michigan State having their turnovers at the right moment. What do I mean by that? A turnover at your own 45-yard line, if you throw a pick and BC picks it off at their own 10, that's a punt. Who really cares? Where Childs has to be careful is if he's going to dump it down or be loose with the ball and BC has forward territory, Bill O'Brien's a pro coach. He capitalizes off all of those kinds of things. Michigan State's D-line and linebackers have been a pleasant surprise. They haven't really been run on. I do think their secondary is still very suspect. I think Castellanos is going to have to exploit that. I don't think he's going to run wild the way he did against Florida State. I think Michigan State's going to have a solid game plan. Joe Rossi's done a great job with the personnel he has. And this is like limited personnel he has right now. I can't imagine what's going to happen in the next 2 years with his own recruits. So give me Michigan State to cover. I do think they bow out heroically in like a 27-24-esque game. I do think special teams could play a big factor in this game. Jonathan Kim, I don't want to confuse him with Noah Kim, is one of the best kickers in the country. Has ice in his veins too. If you just have to watch the Maryland replay to see that the kid isn't really fazed by much. So I think this is actually going to be one of the better games of the conference all week. And I think no matter what happens, I'd be really shocked if MSU got embarrassed or even got blown out in this game. So I think the Spartans are going to play a really sound game and bow out heroically. What say you, Sean?
I think this is a big. No, we're not an ACC pod, but how good is Boston College actually? Like, they've had a couple nice wins, and they played well in the first half against a really good team, and then kind of it all fell apart. Michigan State passed their first test, and I think this is sort of like Maryland on the road. You go in as touchdown underdogs. I think Maryland was a little more than that, and they go in and win it. Boston College is probably a little better than Maryland, so you got to play better than that. But, there is a way that Wild Aiden Childs has an awesome game where he throws for 350 and 3 touchdowns and gets him across the line, even if he does throw 2 interceptions too. But I do think Boston College will win this, and I do think they'll probably not cover. But it could be one where, BC ends up winning by 10, but Michigan State was really there shot for shot the whole way and just kind of – I do think I don't know if they'll cover, but I do think Michigan State will play solid enough to be in the game, sort of like what Boston College actually did in Missouri. Maybe they play really well for a half, and then it all kind of, the better team prevails in the end, or – they kind of just hang around and don't really look like they're going to win, but also don't get blown out. But, it's a good chance to be 4-0 to get a second big road win. This is how you get into the middle of the conference. You compete in games like this, and at the end of the day, when you are close in games, you're going to win some of them. So, definitely going to be one that I'm watching at 8 o'clock on the ACC network. Last one, Joe, we got Purdue going to Oregon State. Purdue trying to bounce back. Oregon State also trying to bounce back from getting smacked by Oregon, their rivals who are also in the Big Ten. It's the first time Oregon's looked good all year. But as we wrap up the pod, Joe, Purdue, really any positives will be a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I think any positives for both teams. I know we're not a Oregon State / Washington State / future / former Pac-12 schools, whatever the heck you want to consider them as. Both teams got their butts handed to them last week.
It's not good for Purdue because they can't play that angle then.
No. This is going to be a battle of like kind of the team psychologists, for lack of a better term. Someone's going to come out. They're both going to come out angry. It's just who's angrier and who uses that better. That's one of the lamest ways to describe a game. I think this is just a game for Purdue, quite frankly, Sean. They need to do a few things defensively. They need to get stops. They didn't get any stops last week. I think doing that and their offense being somewhat efficient is going to give them some confidence. Hey, maybe if they beat Oregon State by a good margin, they might think they have a chance against Oregon on that third Friday in October, the most random Friday, October game you could give Oregon, and perhaps the spoiler makers could reemerge. But I thought that was possible last week. Perhaps this is the first small step of the 100-step staircase that gets them in the right direction.
Yeah, it's just not really a game that you want after. I know these agreements are made years in advance, but why on earth did Purdue have 2 of their 3 non-conference games be good opponents? They're in the rebuilding phase where you want to get wins, you want to sneak bowl eligibility. You probably weren't going to beat Notre Dame. I don't know if it was a return game or if they're going to South Bend next year. If they are, good luck. But Oregon State did give up 49 points to Oregon. Now, Purdue's not as good as Oregon, but there should be some confidence there that maybe Hudson Card can get going, because he is definitely at the worst, an average quarterback in college football. So, big gut check time for Purdue because you're staring 1-2, hosting Nebraska in the face, and then you're probably going to be 1-3, and then from there, finding a win is tough. But you could go 2-1 just like that. So, Joe, I think that's all we have for him today. College basketball is coming soon, just under 2 months. Might be going to 2 days a week until then, but for now, we're just doing college football, so 1 time a week for now. We'll be back next week with a Week 4 recap and a Week 5 preview.